the power of artificial intelligence is going to be absolutely amazing, and it's going to do something interesting to our workforces. Let me just give you one quick example from the legal profession. I work with a lot of law firms, and there's increasing concern in the legal world about the level of automation that's being applied to legal tasks. One of the best examples is so-called e-discovery. Discovery used to be the process, say, in a big corporate case here in New York City. They'd bring in hundreds, thousands of boxes of manila folders and stuff them all into a conference room with 5 or 6 of their young associates and unlimited amounts of coffee. And 6 months later, the young associates would stagger out and say, here are the key pieces of evidence that we will bring to trial. Now, of course, that is done by e-discovery. First of all the documents are digital. If they're not digital, it's easy to scan them. And secondly, it turns out that artificial intelligence can really do a better job, not just a faster, cheaper job, but a better job in many cases. And the classic example of this, a lot of what these AI systems do remain trade secrets. They're very hard to patent, but this one is publicly known because it involves some public research. But it turns out that if you're in a big company and you're doing something you don't want the feds to know about, it's really going over the line, when you write a memo or an email, your grammar improves. No one knows why, but it's statistically significant. You start putting periods in the right places and commas, and you're making complete sentences. So what the e-discovery system does is it just goes through and it gives every employee in the company a literacy rating. You're from 0 to 10. 10 is like you were an English major. 0, you shouldn't be allowed near a keyboard. Then it goes back through and it actually analyzes each employee's own set of communications. And if someone who's a 4 suddenly jumps up to an 8, the e-discovery program says, something's going on here, let's pull these documents out, a human better take a look at them. Now the bad guys are going to learn. Keep it illiterate all the time. Simple. But in fact, these systems learn. And in one of the sort of more ominous uses of this, a very similar program to that is now being introduced in China as part of the anti-corruption campaign. And what it will do in real time is look at all the emails, memos, texts of all the bureaucrats and determine any signs of corruption that might show up. And of course, if it turns out that it's identified corruption properly, then it's learned even more. So the potential there is huge. Now, the point that I want to make about e-discovery, interestingly, is it's beginning to have an impact on what law firms do with their young associates. It sort of upsets this interesting business model, which really used to be law school doesn't teach you how to be a lawyer, doesn't teach you how to practice law. So young associates come into a firm and they do useful things like discovery, drafting contracts, research, and they're a profit center, right? Because they get billed at a few $100s an hour. Now that much of that can be done more cheaply and often better with AI, professional firms in general are beginning to sort of wonder, what do we do with bringing up the next generation of employees? We're seeing this in accounting firms. We're seeing it in advertising companies. A lot of the entry-level jobs that are where people started to sort of advance into the ranks and learn how the business operates, those are the early jobs that are being automated. Let me go back and tell a quick Steve Jobs story first. I knew Steve for many years. I actually met him when he was selling circuit boards in plastic bags in Silicon Valley, and we kept in touch, and I wrote about him quite a bit. One thing about Steve was he never liked to predict the future unless he had something to sell. Then he was pretty clear on what the future was, and it was whatever he was selling. But he was a good businessman. But once I did get him to predict the future, and it's a little sad the way I asked him, now since he's no longer with us, but what I said was, Steve, what kind of computer will you be making when you're 75 years old? He thought about it for a second, and he said, okay. He said, well, it's going to be a tablet. He was actually working on the prototypes of the iPad then, so everything in the world would forever be a tablet. But fill in your favorite smart device here, but he said it'll be a tablet, incredibly thin, maybe even flexible, super high resolution, huge amounts of memory, gigantic connection to the cloud with broadband, lots of intelligence, voice input, voice output. He said, maybe you get it when you're 12 years old. It's your first adult computer. And you get it, you take it out of the box, and it says, "Hi, what's your name?" And you say, "Oh, my name's Steve." And the computer says, "Steve, pleased to meet you." And this computer becomes the absolute center of your 12-year-old life. Everything you do, homework, movies, communications with friends, everything goes through this device. Okay, maybe, back then that was quite a prediction. Maybe these days that's not so far-fetched from the digitally sophisticated 12-year-old of now. But Steve said, this is a really smart computer. So he said, the first week you've got it, you're out walking along. The computer knows you're walking because it's got GPS. So it says, "Steve, where are we going?" And you say, "Oh, I'm going to my tennis lesson." And it says, "Oh, do we go to our tennis lesson every Wednesday at this time? If so, I'll remind you from now on." So it begins to insinuate its way into your life as a helper or a companion. And Steve got this one right too. If you use Cortana or Google Now or Siri, already if you open up your calendars, date books to these things, they'll begin to say things like, "You better leave now for your next appointment because there's heavy traffic on the way." So Steve nailed that one too. But he didn't stop there. He said this is a really, really smart computer. So one day you're 17 years old. It's Friday night. You're up in your bedroom by yourself with your computer, and the computer says, "Steve, why aren't we out tonight?" And you say, "Oh, I broke up with my girlfriend." And the computer says, "Steve, it's the third time it's happened that way. Do you want to talk about it?" Now, we haven't gotten there yet, but we are on the way. And it's through cognitive computing platforms, which are the next level of artificial intelligence. And every company is building these in the cloud now. Microsoft has one, Apple has one, Google has one, Amazon is building one. HP has recently introduced Haven, which is a cloud-based cognitive computing platform. It's interesting, probably the one that's got the most attention is IBM's Watson. And that's because IBM has basically bet the farm on Watson. It's an enormous, enormous investment on their part. But Watson, of course, became famous for becoming the world champion at Jeopardy several years ago, beating the two male human champions. And maybe some of you remember this. I remember watching this and very quickly realized something is really important here. And it was actually this question. There was, the two humans were at podiums, and there was sort of this giant blue light bulb between them that represented Watson. And it was, the standard kind of Jeopardy game where at some point you get to choose the next category. And it was the humans' turn to choose the category, but they were already losing to Watson, who was getting all the answers just like that. And one of the categories was chicks dig this. Chicks dig this. And you could just see the human's eyes light up. Okay, here's something computers don't know anything about. Women, we'll take chicks dig this. Turns out chicks dig this was about female archaeologists. So the first answer, which is how Jeopardy works, was, Kathleen Kenyon's excavation of this city mentioned to Joshua showed that the walls had been repaired 17 times. Beep, Watson got it, Jericho. Humans are still thinking, Joshua, who's Joshua? That's a familiar name. Now who would, right? So now Watson is off practicing medicine, creating recipes. These smart systems will be available to everyone because they reside in the cloud. Intelligent software will be as much a business tool as a spreadsheet, that easily accessed. Just give you one quick example of a current use, which is in the legal profession. It's the process of discovery, which traditionally happens before you go to trial. You get all the evidence in, and in the old days, if it was a big corporate white-collar crime case, you'd get 5 of your young associates, and they'd have hundreds of boxes of files to go through, and you'd put them in a conference room with unlimited amounts of coffee, and they'd stagger out 3 months later and say, well, here's the important pieces of evidence. Now, in these big cases, it's all done by computer, e-discovery, because most of the emails and memos are digitized to begin with. But they've been able to teach computers what to look for in terms of evidence. And my favorite example is that they've discovered, one of the e-discovery companies, they've discovered that when you are in a big company and you're writing a memo or an email about something that's a little bit shady that you really don't want the feds to hear about, your grammar improves. Nobody knows why. There's probably a psychologist studying it right now, but you begin to make complete sentences and put periods where they're supposed to be and commas. So the computer takes advantage of that. When it first goes through every email and document written by everyone in the whole corporation and gives everyone a grammar rating from 0 to 10. Then it goes back through and analyzes each individual's emails and memos. And if all of a sudden somebody who's a grammatical 4 jumps up to a grammatical 9, computer pulls those out and says, a human better take a look at this, something's going on. Now, that's a kind of evidence discovery that humans couldn't do. Now, of course, the bad guys are going to learn, keep it ungrammatical all the time, but the computer will figure that out too. So intelligent software, hugely, hugely important.
Classic safety sign. I've worked with companies that make safety signs, workplace safety signs, over what they call the problem that a workplace safety sign, after 30 days, turns into wallpaper. So with the emergence of digital screens and smart sensors, can we do something better? So people are working on digital smart sensor safety signs, where, for example, if someone approaches to go into a work site and they don't have their gloves or their helmet on, it reminds them. I actually worked with one company that wanted to attach that to pictures of the employees' kids so that the picture of their young children would come up when they were being reminded to wear their helmet, because that's what's at stake. I'm not positive that's going to fly, but that's the sort of idea. So there's going to be a lot we can do on the factory floor, on construction sites, where tools, signs, lots of different things actually monitor the conditions of safety. And I think insurers are actually going to push forward on this quite quickly. So the idea of the virtual safety sign, the virtual safety equipment is very real. Here's an example that actually is being trialed and rolled out in some hospitals. It uses various technologies. This particular example uses video cameras, small video cameras in each room that determines whether, when a practitioner goes into that room, to make sure that they wash their hands before they see the patient and wash their hands after they've seen the patient. Reducing hospital-acquired infections. And it works. It works very well. It's, of course, invasive in a sense, but all of these things are, to some extent, invasive. And that's one of the places that we're going to have a big challenge as we have the ability more and more to monitor our employees in real time, because that's what smart sensors are going to do for us. So here's an example of how odd it could get. It's not odd, but one of my clients is a big organization of convenience stores, and convenience stores are actually pretty good about adopting new technology. By now, most convenience stores have internet-enabled surveillance cameras, so it sort of uploads to the internet automatically, and they can be networked together. People are designing and selling technology that is highly intelligent and watches the video and can actually notice behavior that could be indicative of a shoplifter. Or it will identify a shoplifter and then show when that shoplifter shows up in another of that chain stores, because it turns out shoplifters do have brand preferences. then there's a little warning at the cash register that there's a potential shoplifter in the store. This is being used in lots of different ways. But one use that people are talking about now is, for example, in retail, having cameras that watch employees and actually record in an intelligent way the extent to which the employees make themselves available for customers, the kind of activities they do, how busy they are, all of these things, and puts together a little report at the end of the day that goes to the manager, which, as the manufacturer says, can allow for helpful and constructive discussions. That's one way to put it. But this sort of thing is going to be available, and in an increasingly competitive physical environment, I think we'll probably be looking for ways to make service as good as it can be. And then, of course, what this then leads to is the whole question of work at home. So you've heard some great things today about work at home, and this is just the beginning of a very complicated discussion we're going to have over things like ergonomics. What's the responsibility of the employer for ergonomics at home? How do we keep track of whether the employee is actually working or not? Are we getting to the point where we're actually going to be monitoring the employee as they are at home? There's actually some reasons that you might want to do that. But of course, it's going to be a very, very delicate balance to maintain.